That autumn, the whole of Edinburgh was speaking about the same thing. The Duke of Strathmere had returned. He had been gone for 4 years. First to the war on the continent, then to whatever dark place a man retreats to when the war is finished. But the war has not finished with him, and now he was back. His estate at Lochend sat 12 miles from the city, and by the time the morning papers reached the breakfast tables, there was not a drawing room in Newtown that was not already discussing it. In the servants' hall of a modest boarding house on Harriet Row, a young woman heard the news from the cook. They say he came through the city gate before dawn, Mrs. Petwick said, not looking up from the bread she was flouring. His carriage, his men, the whole of it. My cousin's husband was there. Says the Duke looked like a man who hadn't slept in a year. The young woman did not respond immediately. She was standing at the window, looking out at the gray morning. Her name in this house was Margaret Barr. She was thin, quiet, the kind of person who could be in a room for an hour before anyone quite noticed she was there. The other servants thought she was unremarkable. She did not correct them. Her real name was something else entirely. Leonora Strathmere had grown up at Lochend, not as a servant, as the daughter of the house. Her father, the previous Duke, had died 4 years ago. The title passed to a distant cousin, Aldrich Strathmere, who had been a second son of a second son, a military man with no particular attachment to the estate, a man she had met exactly 3 times before he went to war. Under the terms of an old entail she had not known existed until the solicitor read it aloud. Leonora inherited nothing. Not the house, not the land, not even the furniture in her mother's sitting room. The estate passed whole to the new Duke, and Leonora passed into a quiet kind of poverty that good breeding prevented her from mentioning in public. She had found work, first as a governess in Glasgow, then here, in Edinburgh, as a lady's maid to a Mrs. Paget, who was not unkind but was not attentive either. It was manageable. That was all she allowed herself to think about it. But Aldrich Strathmere had returned, and in 11 days the new estate solicitor had written to her, twice now, requesting that she attend a meeting at Lochend regarding certain personal effects of her father's that had been discovered during a restoration of the East Wing. Leonora had not yet replied. She turned from the window. "More tea, Mrs. Petwick?" The cook looked up. "You're quiet this morning." "I'm always quiet." Mrs. Petwick made a sound that was not quite agreement. She went back to the bread. Leonora went back to work. She thought about the letters as she climbed the stairs. She had been thinking about them since the first one arrived 3 weeks ago, folded and sealed with the Strathmere crest, her father's crest, now belonging to another man. Personal effects. The phrase had stopped her cold. Her father had kept a room on the east side that she had not been permitted to enter as a child. He had always been particular about that room. She had never thought to ask why. She thought about it now, and she thought about the Duke, Aldrich Strathmere, a man who had stood at her father's funeral looking politely uncomfortable, who had shaken her hand and said the correct words, who had looked at the house with the careful eyes of a man trying not to appear covetous of something that was about to become his. She had not liked him. She had not disliked him either. He had simply been someone who had taken her home, and she had not been able to look at him long enough to form a clear opinion. That was 4 years ago. She wrote back to the solicitor that evening. She would come. She would need a position. She wrote something practical. She was experienced as a lady's maid and was prepared to work. She did not sign her real name. She arrived at Lochend on a Thursday. The house looked the same. That was the thing that struck her first. Not the grandeur of it, not the familiar skyline of the roofline against the hills, but the sameness, the same gate, the same gravel lane, the same cluster of birches on the south side of the drive that her mother had planted the year Leonora was born. She had expected it to feel different, belonging to someone else. It did not feel different. It only felt like hers, still, which was worse. She was hired as a housemaid. The housekeeper, a woman named Dunbar, not a name from her father's time, looked her over with the detached efficiency of someone assessing a piece of furniture, asked 3 questions, and told her to report the following morning. Leonora said yes. Thank you, ma'am. She did not blink. She did not see the Duke for the first 3 days. The house was not small, and the Duke was not a man who moved through rooms making his presence known. She heard him once, a door closing on the upper floor, a single word spoken to a footman in the hall, and that was all. On the 4th day, she was in the library. She had been sent to dust the shelves on the north wall. The library had been her father's favorite room, and she had spent half her childhood in the chair by the east window, reading books he pulled down for her himself. That chair was still there. It was still in the same position. No one had moved it. She was standing on the step stool reaching for the upper shelf when the door opened. She did not look down immediately. She heard the footsteps stop. "I beg your pardon." A man's voice, low, careful. She stepped down and turned. Duke of Strathmere was standing inside the door. He was taller than she remembered. Or perhaps the house had always made people seem smaller, and now she was seeing him from the floor instead of across a parlor. He was lean in the way that men become lean after long months of poor eating and poor sleeping. His face was older. Not old. He could not have been more than 33, but marked. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there 4 years ago, and a particular quality to his expression that she recognized. The face of someone who had learned to keep very still in order to control what other people could see. She recognized it because she wore it herself. "Your Grace." She dropped a curtsy, looked at a point slightly past his left shoulder. He looked at her. She felt it without meeting his eyes. "Carry on," he said, and moved to the desk. She turned back to the shelves. She heard him sit. The sound of papers. Silence. She worked for 20 minutes. He did not speak again. When she stepped down from the stool for the last time and gathered her cloth and her tin of polish, she crossed toward the door. She did not look at him. "That chair," Duke of Strathmere said. She stopped. "The one by the window." A pause. "I've asked Mrs. Dunbar to move it twice. It keeps reappearing." Leonora looked at the chair. A very specific kind of stillness settled over her. "Perhaps the other maids find it useful for the curtains," she said. "Perhaps." He did not sound convinced. He also did not sound troubled by it. He sounded, if anything, as though he were speaking to himself as much as to her. "My predecessor apparently kept it there." "Yes," she said. "I believe so." She left. She told herself, walking back down the servant's stair, that this was fine. He had not recognized her. He had seen her exactly once, at a funeral, in grief, wearing black. A different woman entirely. She was a housemaid. She would collect her father's things from the solicitor. She would leave. She repeated this to herself 3 more times before she believed it even slightly. The Duke was not an easy man to read. She came to understand that over the following 2 weeks, in the way you come to understand something when you are moving quietly through the same rooms as another person and neither of you is speaking. He was up before the household. He ate little. He spent long hours in the library or walking the grounds, alone, always alone, and he treated the staff with a courtesy that was real without being warm. He answered questions. He made decisions. He did not make conversation. The footman who had been at Lochend since her father's time told her, in the servants' hall one evening, that the Duke had not received a single social call since returning, that he had declined 3 invitations from Edinburgh society, that he slept badly. Everyone knew because the candle in his study window burned until 2 most mornings. Leonora listened. She did not offer an opinion, but she noticed the candle herself from the yard on nights when she could not sleep either. The solicitor's meeting happened on a Wednesday. He came to the house, a small man with spectacles and a manner of speaking that suggested he considered every sentence a potential legal document. He met with Leonora in the housekeeper's room, which Mrs. Dunbar lent without asking why, and he set a wooden box on the table between them. Inside the box, 3 letters in her father's hand, addressed to her by name, her real name, a miniature portrait of her mother, a deed for a small cottage on the Perthshire coast that had apparently been purchased privately, not part of the entailed estate, and that had somehow been overlooked by the solicitors at the time of her father's death. Leonora sat very still. She looked at the letters. "No one is aware of this," the solicitor said quietly. "The Duke's household has no record of the Perthshire property. I discovered it myself during the East Wing Hervé, and I considered it my duty to inform you directly." "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steady. She did not open the letters until she was alone, in her room. That night, the door shut, a single candle at the bedside. Her father's handwriting was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, the way voices are when you have been away long enough. He wrote to her as though she were still the child sitting in the library chair. He wrote to her about the cottage, that he had bought it as a place for her, always, in case the entail became her inheritance instead of the house. He wrote to her that he was sorry. He wrote it 3 times across 3 separate letters, and each time the word looked smaller than the time before. She folded the letters. She put them back in the box. She did not sleep. The next morning she went to the library to collect the cleaning things that had been left the day before. She expected it to be empty. It was not. Aldrich Strathmere was at the desk. He looked up when she entered. She said what she had come to say, about the cloths. He nodded. She crossed the room. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. She stopped, turned slightly. "Yes, Your Grace." He was looking at the papers in front of him, not at her. "I've been told you keep the East reading room in a particular order, that the books are arranged as they were before." "I arranged them as I found them," she said carefully. "Who told you how to find them?" A silence. "I looked at the older shelves," she said. "The dust showed the original positions." He looked up then. He had gray eyes. She had not particularly noticed before, with the quality of looking without revealing, the way still water does not tell you how deep it is. "That was thoughtful," he said. She did not know what to do with that. So she said nothing, gathered what she had come for, and left. She thought about the conversation all through dinner and through the evening, and past the point when the candle in the study window went dark. She thought about it because she had been careful, and careful had not been quite enough. The second conversation happened in the East Garden. She had been sent to pick late herbs from the kitchen beds. He was standing at the far end of the garden, looking out at the hills. He did not look like a man at leisure. He looked like a man who had walked somewhere and then forgotten the reason. She worked quietly. She did not speak. After a while, without turning, he said, "How long have you been in service?" "4 years," she said, which was true, before Edinburgh, Glasgow. Also true. He turned. He was looking at her directly now, not in the absent way he had looked in the library, but with attention. She kept her eyes on the herbs. "You speak very precisely," he said. "Do I?" She kept her voice mild. "For someone who spent 4 years in domestic service." He paused. "You have an educated woman's cadence." The quiet between them had weight. Leonora made a decision. She looked up. "My mother was a school teacher," she said, "before she married." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, and looked back at the hills. "The war changes a person's ear," he said, "to the middle distance rather than to her. You spend long enough listening for truth in what men say, and you start to hear it everywhere, even when it isn't there." A pause. "I find I don't always know the difference now." She said nothing. She straightened up with the basket. She looked at him, truly looked, for 1 second, and she saw what the cook at the boarding house had described. A man who had not slept in a year, Not the sleeplessness of illness, but of something that did not leave you alone long enough to rest. "Does it help?" she said. "Being back?" He turned. She had surprised him. That was clear. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded. She went back to the house. That night she sat in her room with the 3 letters in the box on the table in front of her. She had a cottage in Perthshire. She had a name she had not used in 4 years. She had come here for a box of letters, and discovered that leaving was now more complicated than arriving had been. The reason was not fully clear to her. She pushed at it the way you push at something in the dark, knowing only its outline. She told herself it was the house, that it was simply hard to leave the house. A week later, the Edinburgh social calls arrived. They came all at once, as Edinburgh society tends to do things. In a group, with purpose, bearing cake. 3 carriages, 6 women. The Countess of Dunmore, who held herself as though posture were a moral position, led the party and did most of the speaking. They had been, she said, waiting most patiently. They understood the Duke required time to readjust, but the season was approaching, and Strathmere had always been a central part of the social fabric, and surely he would be attending Lady Pemberton's musicale on the 14th. Leonora was carrying trays that afternoon. She was supposed to be invisible, and she was invisible. And she watched Duke Strathmere sit in the drawing room with 6 women who meant him no harm and speak to them with the same careful, flattened courtesy he used for everything. He said he would consider the musicale. He would not go. She could tell. The way he held the teacup. The way his eyes went briefly to the window, to the hills. The way a man looks at an exit. She came back for the trays when the visitors had gone. The drawing room was empty except for him. He was standing by the mantelpiece, not touching it, just standing near it. 6 callers, she said. She had not intended to say anything. It came out. He turned. He had clearly forgotten she was there. "Yes," he said. "That's the most in 3 weeks. It is." He looked at her without the polite mask he'd worn for the callers. Without very much at all. "Do you find that remarkable?" "I find it expected," she said. This was always a social house. He was still. Was it? The room was very quiet. Leonora heard what she had just said. She set the tray down slowly. "I've heard that from the older staff," she said. "Mr. Finch, he's been here 20 years. Duke Strathmere looked at her for a long moment. "You speak as though you know the house." "I know it," she said, "in the way one comes to know a place by looking carefully." He said nothing. She took the tray and left. She walked down the hall faster than necessary. She stopped at the end of the corridor, pressed her hand against the cold plaster wall. The house. Her house. The plaster was the same. The particular chill of this corridor in October was the same. She had run down this corridor at 8 years old, and at 12, and at 17, and her father had stood at that end with his hands in his pockets and said her name in the voice he only used when he was trying not to laugh at her. She closed her eyes, opened them. Then she heard footsteps. He had followed her. Or rather, he was walking in this direction, which she should have anticipated, because the east wing was down this corridor, and he had said once that he walked in the evenings. He stopped when he saw her. She straightened. "Your Grace." He looked at her. Something had shifted in his face, not quite the guarded flatness from the drawing room, but something newer, closer. "You said this was always a social house," he said. "Not I've heard it was." The silence was the longest she had allowed herself. "My mother worked here once," she said. "When she was young." She described it. He watched her. He was quiet in the way he was always quiet, that particular stillness that was not absence but compression, as though he were holding something in by the careful arrangement of his body. "What is your name?" he said, not as a question, as something else. "Margaret Barr," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what Mrs. Dunbar's records say." Another long quiet. He did not pursue it. He nodded once and walked on. She stayed where she was until she heard the door at the far end of the corridor close. Then she went to the kitchen and sat down at the empty table and put her face in her hands and tried to think clearly. She could not. She had been here for 5 weeks. She had her father's letters. She had the address of a cottage she had never seen. She had enough now to leave. She should have left already. She was not sure what she was staying for. That was a lie. She was staying because this house still knew her, even when she pretended otherwise. She was staying because the chair in the library was still where it had always been, and he had asked about it twice now, and she did not know what that meant. She was staying because a man she had expected to be an absence had turned out to be a presence. A real one, a particular kind. The kind that asked whether it helped to be home without explaining why he asked. She said nothing to herself about that. She was very firm about that. The following morning he found her in the library again. This time she had not been sent there. She had gone herself. Early, before the household had quite woken, and she was sitting in the chair by the window. Her father's first letter was in her hands. She was not reading it. She was looking at the hills. She heard the door and stood quickly. He stopped. She was holding the letter. The address on the outside, her real address in her father's hand, was visible. Neither of them spoke. He crossed the room. He came to stand a few feet from her, not close, not aggressive, but with intention. "May I?" he said. She handed him the letter. She did not know why, perhaps because it was his house, perhaps because she was tired. He read only the outside, her name, her full name. He lowered the letter and looked at her. "Leonora Strathmere," he said. "Yes, the previous Duke's daughter. Yes." He stood very still. She watched him think. She could see him doing it, the real thinking, not the social performance of consideration, but the actual movement of a mind working through something unexpected. "Why?" he said. "Just the one word. Because the solicitor wrote to me," she said. "He found my father's letters, and things belonging to me. I needed to come to collect them, and I needed a reason to be in the house, and—" She stopped. "It was impractical. I know it was impractical. That wasn't what I was asking." She looked at him. "I meant," he said, "why did you stay? You've been here 5 weeks. The solicitor's business could have been resolved in a day." The fire in the grate had burned low. Outside the window, the hills were gray and very still. "I didn't know how to leave," she said. He looked at her, that look with the gray eyes, the still water that didn't tell you its depth. "This was your home?" "Yes." He sat down, not at the desk, but in the chair opposite the window, the chair that had always been her father's chair for guests. He set his elbows on his knees and looked at the fire. "I didn't know," he said, "that there was a daughter. When the entail was explained to me, I was informed there were no direct heirs. I was told the estate would pass uncontested." He looked up. "I would have." He stopped. He shook his head, not at her, at himself. "It doesn't change what happened, but I would have wanted to know." Leonora sat back down. She was not sure when she decided to. "The solicitors managed it efficiently," she said. "Efficiently and incorrectly." He almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost. How long have you been in service?" 4 years, since the estate was settled." "Yes." He looked at the fire again. He was quiet for a long time. She did not fill the silence. She had learned, these past weeks, that his silences were not empty. They were where he kept the things he was actually thinking. "I've been in this house for 6 weeks, he said at last. "And I've spent most of that time trying to understand why it doesn't feel like mine." She looked at him. "I thought it was the war," he said. "I came back from the continent. Everything felt wrong. My lodgings in Edinburgh, the clubs, the social calls." He paused. "I thought perhaps a house would help. An estate. Something fixed and large and permanent." He turned and looked at her directly. "But there is something in this house that resists me, and I believe I may understand it better now." She did not look away. "It's just a house." "No," he said. "It isn't." And the way he said it, quiet, certain, not performing anything for her benefit, made her chest do something she had not given it permission to do. She folded her father's letter carefully. She placed it in her lap. "What will you do?" she asked. "I'd like to hear about it," he said. "The house, if you're willing. I'd like to know what it was, and what it should still be. And what it should still be." He said it without looking away. She looked at the window, the hills, the birch trees her mother had planted. "There used to be a garden on the west side," she said. "My mother's. It's been dug over." "I know," he said. "I've been looking at it. I didn't know what it was. I could tell you what was there. I would like that." The fire popped. Outside, wind moved through the birches. She heard it the way she had always heard it. The sound this house made when the weather came in from the north, which was almost every morning, which was Scotland. She told him about the West Garden. She told him about her father's reading habits, the organization of the shelves, the lamp he kept on the desk that had now been replaced by a different one. She told him about the East Corridor in winter, and why the cold gathered there, and what her father had always meant to do about it, but never had. She told him things she had not said aloud in 4 years, things she had carried so quietly they had almost stopped feeling like speech, and he listened the way she had seen him listen in the garden. Without performing attention, simply with it. When she stopped, the room had grown dark enough that the fire was the main light. "You should not have had to come here in disguise," he said. "No," she agreed. "I would like to make that right." He paused. "I don't know precisely how yet." She looked at him. "Precisely how is not required immediately. No, that almost smile again. I suppose not." She stood. He stood. They were the same height. She had not known that 4 years ago at the funeral. "My name is Aldrich," he said. Not an announcement. A correction. "Not your grace. Not in this room." She looked at him a moment. "Leonora," she said. He nodded. She moved toward the door. He did not stop her. But as she reached it, she turned. "The chair," she said. He looked at the chair by the window. "It was always there," she said. "My father put it there the year I was born. He said he wanted somewhere to sit and watch the hills when it was too cold for the garden." She paused. "I think you should leave it." He looked at the chair, then he looked at her. "I think so too," he said. She went. She walked down the corridor in the dark, and she did not press her hand against the cold plaster this time. She walked steadily, and she thought about nothing, and everything, and the particular quality of a silence that is full rather than empty, which she had almost forgotten existed, and which she had spent the past 6 weeks sitting inside without naming it. Winter came quickly to Lochend. The hills went gray and then white, and the birches rattled against the east windows in the mornings. Leonora stayed. There was no formal arrangement at first. She simply stopped presenting herself to Mrs. Dunbar as a housemaid, and Mrs. Dunbar, with the pragmatic tact of a woman who had managed large houses for 20 years, said nothing about it. Aldrich said nothing either. He simply began leaving a second cup on the library desk. They talked in the mornings, mostly. About the house, at first, what she remembered, what he was planning, what could be restored, and what had been changed beyond saving. About the Perthshire cottage, which he insisted on sending a surveyor to assess at his own expense. About the entail, which he had instructed his solicitors to examine for what he called procedural irregularities, in a tone that made his solicitors look uncomfortable. Then about other things. About the war, or around it, the edges of it. The particular way he spoke of those years as a collection of facts he was still sorting into order. About her time in Glasgow, which had been lonely in ways she could say plainly now. About what it meant to come back to something that was and was not yours. He trusted her before she expected it. She knew it had happened when he started speaking to her about the estate decisions, not for approval, but because he wanted the thinking out loud. And she realized, one morning in late November, that she trusted him too, that she had, quietly, without deciding to, come to believe that he meant what he said and would do what he said he would do, which was not something she would have predicted of anyone 4 years ago. One morning in December, she came into the library and found him already there. He was at the window, looking at the snow on the hills. She came to stand a few feet from him. They stood like that for a while. "I keep expecting it to feel like mine," he said. "Does it not? It's beginning to." He turned. "That's not entirely because of the house." She looked at the hills. "I should tell you," she said, "that when I arrived, I did not plan to stay past a week. I know. I wasn't certain about you. I know that too." He paused. "Are you still uncertain?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had always thought about things, fully, without hurrying. "No," she said. He looked at her. The gray light made everything in the room very still. "The cottage in Perthshire," he said. "The surveyor's report was good. It's sound. Small, but sound." He paused. "You don't have to stay here for lack of somewhere else to go." "I know. I want to be sure you understand that." "I understand it." She turned. "I'm staying because I want to be here." He was quiet for a moment. "Here in the house?" "Yes," she said. "And here with you." There was a sound from the hallway. Mrs. Dunbar's voice, distant, managing something. The fire settled. Outside, the snow had started again. "Leonora," he said. She looked at him. He said nothing else for a moment. He only looked at her the way he looked at the hills in the early morning, not as a view, but as something that oriented him, something by which he knew where he was. "I've been back 7 weeks," he said. "Most of it I've spent waiting for something to settle, some part of me." He paused. "It hasn't settled, but it has moved. I don't know how to say it more plainly than that." "You don't need to say it more plainly." "No?" "No." He looked at her a long time. She looked back. The snow came in off the hills and the birch trees moved, and the fire was warm and the chair was where it had always been. "Will you stay?" he said. Not in the household. As yourself." "I was always myself," she said. "Yes." Something shifted in his face. Something that had been carefully arranged for a long time came slightly undone. Just slightly, just enough. "That's the thing I noticed first." She smiled. A real one, small, the kind she had kept quiet for years. "You noticed on the stool, in the library. The first day." "I noticed before that," he said. "At the gate, when you arrived." She had not known that. "You were looking at the birch trees," he said. "Not the house, not the drive, the birch trees on the south side, and I thought—" He stopped. "I didn't know what I thought. I know now. Outside, the snow fell on Leonora's mother's trees. Inside, the fire burned in her father's grate, and the chair stood where it had always stood, and the house was quiet in the particular way of a house that has finally stopped waiting." "Stay," he said. "I will," she said. That spring Edinburgh talked about many things, as Edinburgh does. But one piece of news crossed every table, reached every drawing room, was discussed at every social call the Countess of Dunmore was involved with, and several she was not. The Duke of Strathmere had married, the previous Duke's daughter. The girl everyone had believed to have simply disappeared. She had been in the house all along. She had simply been waiting to be found. Those who were invited to Lochend that summer found a house that was different from what they remembered. Not grander, not more formal, but more itself. The west garden had been restored. The east corridor had finally been addressed. The library was arranged in a particular order that no one could quite explain, but that everyone found oddly comfortable. The two of them stood by the window sometimes, the Duke and his Duchess, looking out at the hills together. They were not people who performed happiness, but anyone who looked carefully could see it, in the way they stood, in the way they spoke, in the way neither of them seemed to need the room to be any different than it was. The house, people said, finally felt like a home. Those who had known it before said, "Yes, that is exactly right."